The organization did not operate on rules alone. It operated on access. Titles were displayed publicly. Reporting lines were documented precisely. Authority charts were clean, rational, and defensible. But real influence lived elsewhere, in who could enter a room without announcement, who could request 5 unscheduled minutes and receive them, who possessed the physical means to unlock restricted corridors without explanation. Access defined velocity. At the center stood an executive whose authority had never been formally contested. Years of controlled outcomes had secured institutional trust. The board relied on his strategic calibration. Department heads aligned instinctively before presenting proposals. His approval was rarely loud, rarely enthusiastic. It was measured. That was enough. He kept his office physically open. Psychologically, it was narrower. No one described him as distant. They described him as precise. Conversation with him felt like entering a room already arranged. Every word had weight. Every pause was interpreted. He understood the architecture he inhabited. He did not grip power visibly. He shaped pathways. Beneath him, the operational director functioned as structural spine, responsible for cross-department coordination, performance execution, and infrastructural continuity. The role required consistency rather than spotlight. Results spoke through metrics, not presence. The director possessed detailed visibility into processes the executive rarely examined personally. Workflow friction, resource allocation tension, cultural undercurrents. Where the executive operated at altitude, the director navigated terrain. The imbalance was subtle. Strategic design flowed downward. Operational intelligence flowed upward. But the key distinction lay in filtration. Every upward movement passed through the executive's interpretive frame before reaching the board. That filtration created stability. It also created dependency. The turning point arrived without ceremony. During an extended international negotiation cycle, the executive required prolonged absence from headquarters. Not a symbolic absence, physical removal from daily rhythm. Time zone differences reduced synchronous contact. Decision windows narrowed. Before departure, he convened a restricted session. He authorized temporary signatory power to the operational director for mid-level capital approvals and vendor realignments within predefined thresholds. The delegation was clear, documented, and time-bound. Temporary. Borrowed. The board ratified the measure as procedural efficiency. The director accepted without visible shift in posture. No expanded tone. No increased assertion. He continued routine cadence. Only now certain signatures required his authorization rather than executive review. For weeks, the system functioned without friction. Requests that once waited for executive clearance now moved through operational channels within hours. Vendor negotiations closed faster. Minor infrastructural upgrades accelerated. Departments adjusted to the reduced latency. The executive monitored remotely through dashboards and summary briefs. Metrics remained stable. No deviation triggered alarm. But something unrecorded was forming. Department heads began noticing the difference in friction. They did not feel rebellion. They felt relief. The director's responses were concise. Questions were addressed without interpretive framing. Decisions were explained through operational logic rather than strategic narrative. Conversations felt less performative. The difference was not warmth. It was immediacy. When the executive returned, temporary authority was scheduled to retract automatically. The formal delegation expired on the calendar. In practice, however, behavioral memory did not expire. For several days, departments continued routing certain approvals to the director out of habit. He redirected them upward without commentary. The executive observed the misrouting. He corrected it subtly during meetings, reaffirming approval channels without overt admonition. The room recalibrated. But the experience had introduced comparison. Access had proven transferable. Weeks later, during a quarterly efficiency review, the board noted improved operational throughput during the executive's absence. Cycle times had decreased measurably. Minor capital initiatives had executed ahead of schedule. The data did not indict central authority, but it complicated exclusivity. A board member inquired whether partial delegation could continue permanently within defined boundaries to preserve momentum. The executive paused before responding. He did not resist. He reframed. Delegation, he explained, functioned effectively because it operated within strategic alignment established at the top. Without unified direction, distributed authority risks fragmentation. The reasoning was sound. The board agreed. Yet they authorized a structured pilot, limited operational signatory authority within narrow financial bands, subject to quarterly review. The key was returned, but a duplicate was cut. The director did not display visible expansion of presence. He applied authority conservatively. Only approvals clearly within mandate were signed. Anything ambiguous was escalated. Precision built trust. Trust widened comfort. Over subsequent months, departments began consulting the director earlier in project conception, not because they bypassed the executive deliberately, but because operational clarity felt safer in early stages. Ideas matured laterally before ascending vertically. The executive noticed shifts in sequence during leadership meetings. Proposals arrived more refined, less exploratory. Preliminary debate had already occurred elsewhere. He adjusted meeting flow to reclaim first examination of emerging initiatives. He asked probing questions earlier. He invited departments to surface concepts before internal alignment. They complied, but internal rehearsal continued discreetly. The imbalance deepened quietly. During cross-functional crises, department heads instinctively contacted the director first. His knowledge of workflow interdependencies made him an efficient triage point. The executive was informed afterward with structured summaries. The executive's authority remained intact, yet immediacy had migrated. Access to decisive action was no longer singular. One afternoon, during a facility systems failure that threatened operational continuity, the director authorized emergency expenditure within delegated limits without waiting for executive consultation. The action prevented downtime. By the time the executive was briefed, resolution was already in motion. He endorsed the decision publicly. Privately, he measured the implication. Competence under pressure solidifies legitimacy. The board commended responsiveness during the next review cycle. They referenced operational agility as evidence of matured governance structure. Language evolved. Distributed resilience entered meeting vocabulary. The executive recognized the phrase. Resilience diffuses dependency. Dependency once centered around him. Now it was being redesigned. He began tightening narrative control in executive briefings, emphasizing long-term strategic coherence, reinforcing that operational acceleration functioned within his design parameters. The framing was accurate, but repetition suggested containment. The director remained disciplined. He avoided public credit accumulation. When praised, he redirected acknowledgement toward cross-department coordination. His restraint amplified credibility. Peers increasingly sought his perspective in advance of formal submission, not for endorsement, but for calibration. Calibration had become bilateral. The borrowed key no longer felt temporary. It felt integrated. The executive sensed that reclaiming exclusivity would require visible contraction of operational autonomy. Such contraction, without failure justification, would signal insecurity. He chose observation over reaction. For now, because imbalance had not yet matured into displacement. It remained architectural, subtle, but irreversible forces rarely announce themselves loudly. They shift weight gradually, until structure reorients around them. And in quiet corridors, access was already learning to exist without singular permission. The executive did not respond to structural drift with confrontation. He responded with refinement. Open resistance would imply threat. Threat would legitimize comparison. Instead, he recalibrated architecture from within, subtle adjustments designed to preserve central gravity without appearing defensive. The first move was informational. He restructured reporting cadence. All delegated approvals were now to be accompanied by strategic annotation, brief contextual statements explaining how each operational decision reinforced long-term vision. These annotations would be compiled into a quarterly synthesis reviewed exclusively by him before reaching the board. The change appeared procedural. It restored filtration. The director complied without hesitation. Annotations were concise, analytically sound, free of embellishment. They did not exaggerate strategic alignment. They demonstrated it through metrics. Compression requires friction. The executive introduced a secondary measure. Any initiative approved under delegated authority that crossed departmental boundaries, even indirectly, would require executive pre-brief before implementation. Financial thresholds remained intact, but functional overlap now triggered oversight. On paper, it was risk mitigation. In practice, it slowed cross-functional momentum. The director adjusted workflows accordingly. Initiatives were modularized to avoid unnecessary cross-boundary classification. Implementation was sequenced in phases that respected new constraints while preserving overall objective. Nothing violated policy. Everything complied. Yet velocity remained. The executive noticed. Containment through structure was proving insufficient because competence absorbed friction without visible strain. He shifted strategy. Rather than tightening delegation, he elevated visibility. He began attending operational review meetings more frequently, not to override decisions, but to observe early-stage discussions. His presence altered atmosphere immediately. Conversation became sharper, more measured. Participants selected language carefully. Silence lengthened between comments. The director maintained steady tone. He neither deferred excessively nor asserted dominance. He facilitated discussion, occasionally inviting executive perspective without relinquishing coordination. The dynamic grew layered. Authority was now co-present in rooms previously governed by operational cadence alone. Psychological pressure increased. Department heads sensed dual audiences, the operational director for feasibility, the executive for strategic interpretation. Preparation intensified. Risk appetite narrowed slightly. The executive observed the narrowing and interpreted it as restored discipline. The director observed it and recognized emerging caution. Caution accumulates. It does not collapse performance immediately. It constrains experimentation quietly. Within 6 months, exploratory initiatives decreased in frequency. Most submissions focused on optimization rather than expansion. The board, reviewing quarterly dashboards, noticed stabilization in efficiency, but stagnation in innovation. One director inquired whether the organization was becoming operationally precise at the expense of adaptive growth. The executive responded with measured reassurance. Optimization creates foundation for future expansion. The director accepted the explanation, but the question lingered. Compression had unintended side effects. The executive initiated a strategic retreat with senior leadership. The stated purpose: recalibrate growth trajectory. The subtext: reassert narrative control over modernization momentum. During the retreat, he articulated a refined 5-year expansion blueprint. Market diversification, digital integration, geographic scaling. The framework was comprehensive. He invited feedback. The director offered analytical reinforcement. Operational capacity could support projected expansion if modernization timelines accelerated in specific areas. The executive nodded, acknowledging the interdependence. Yet something subtle occurred in that exchange. Expansion strategy now required operational acceleration. Operational acceleration required director-level orchestration. Dependence had inverted directionally. The executive recognized the inversion privately. Strategic ambition without operational agility is theoretical. Operational agility without strategic endorsement is constrained. Balance was shifting toward mutual reliance. Compression could not eliminate this interdependence without harming trajectory. He adopted a different approach. Instead of constricting delegated authority, he redefined performance attribution. During board presentations, he began explicitly linking operational improvements to strategic blueprint milestones he had articulated. Modernization became evidence of his foresight rather than independent initiative. The narrative was accurate. It also repositioned origin of momentum. The director remained neutral in public sessions. He did not contest framing. He provided data when asked, supported projections, reinforced alignment language. Externally, the hierarchy appeared consolidated. Internally, however, perception diverged. Department heads experienced modernization as operationally driven. They witnessed the director's daily orchestration. They associated acceleration with proximity to his office rather than strategic blueprints presented quarterly. Influence operates through lived experience, not presentation. Compression intensified quietly. The executive requested a comprehensive risk audit of all delegated decisions over the previous fiscal year. The audit scope extended beyond financial compliance to include cultural and structural impact. It was a deep review. The director welcomed it. Audit findings revealed no procedural violations. Decision rationales were documented thoroughly. Financial exposure remained within mandate. Cultural impact indicators were stable. The audit reinforced operational credibility rather than diminishing it. The executive accepted the findings without visible frustration. Containment through scrutiny had failed. He shifted focus again, this time toward temporal control. He introduced phased approval windows. Certain categories of delegated decisions could only be executed during designated review cycles unless emergency criteria were met. The change slowed responsiveness slightly. The director adjusted planning cadence accordingly. Teams learned to align initiatives with cycle windows. Emergency classifications remained rare and justified. Momentum decreased marginally but did not reverse. Meanwhile, board confidence in distributed resilience solidified further. External consultants benchmarking governance models cited the organization as example of balanced authority structure. Balanced. The word carried weight. The executive recognized its implication. Balance implies parity. Parity reduces singular indispensability. In private reflection, he assessed strategic options. Reclaiming exclusivity would require visible structural rollback, contradicting performance data and external validation. Accepting parity required internal recalibration of identity. He chose neither extreme. Instead, he began withdrawing from operational detail voluntarily. Attendance at review meetings decreased. Pre-brief requirements were relaxed selectively. Approval windows remained, but were interpreted with flexibility. The compression phase shifted from active restriction to passive observation. The director noticed the withdrawal but did not accelerate expansion. He maintained steady rhythm, neither capitalizing on space nor retreating. Restraint preserved equilibrium. Gradually, operational rooms regained original cadence. Discussion lengthened organically. Participants spoke before anticipating executive synthesis. Innovation metrics began recovering incrementally. The executive monitored from distance. He observed that authority exercised sparingly regained weight. When he did intervene, attention sharpened. When he remained silent, initiative unfolded without visible strain. Compression had clarified something essential. Control applied continuously erodes elasticity. Control applied selectively preserves it. The director's legitimacy now rested not on borrowed authority, but on demonstrated continuity under pressure. The key had never been returned entirely. It had been absorbed into structure. The executive understood that final repositioning would require a decision more fundamental than procedural adjustment. It would require redefining where authority began and where it did not need to. The next phase would determine permanence. The men who built empires rarely spoke about ambition. They spoke about insulation. By the time most people notice power, it has already been structured. The visible move is never the first move. It is the last. The vault is not a container. It is a delay mechanism. The amateur tries to win today. The strategist decides who wins 5 years from now. And that difference is invisible to the impatient. You were taught to chase opportunity. But opportunity is noisy. It demands attention. It flatters urgency. It rewards motion. Power does not move like that. It builds quiet leverage. Look at how capital compounds. Not through dramatic action, but through structured positioning. A single disciplined system outperforms 100 emotional reactions. This is why most people never enter the vault. Because entering requires restraint. The third lock is this. You must prefer positioning over performance. Performance is applause. Positioning is ownership. One fades when the audience leaves. The other grows while no one is watching. The wealthy do not ask, "How do I look?" They ask, "Where am I placed?" Placement determines leverage. Leverage determines influence. Influence determines outcomes. And outcomes, over time, become inevitabilities. You can work hard and remain exposed. Or you can structure intelligently and become insulated. The difference is architecture. Most men focus on income. Few focus on control of flow. The stream matters less than the direction of the river. If you control direction, you control the outcome. This is why vault thinkers obsess over structure. They ask, who benefits if I disappear? Who suffers if I withdraw? What continues without me? If everything collapses without you, you built labor, not leverage. True power survives absence. And absence is the ultimate test. Silence reveals strength. Markets fluctuate. Reputation fluctuates. Trends fluctuate. But structure, if built correctly, absorbs shock. That is insulation. The world rewards visible aggression in the short term. But long-term dominance belongs to those who master quiet positioning. They move early. They prepare silently. They let time fight on their behalf. Time is the only ally that compounds without fatigue. The vault mindset does not chase growth. It engineers inevitability. There is a difference. Growth can reverse. Inevitability does not. When you understand positioning, you stop reacting. You begin selecting. You choose where to stand before the storm forms. You build doors before threat arrives. You secure assets before they become popular. The crowd buys noise. The strategist buys structure. This is why discipline feels lonely. Because positioning is invisible to observers. No applause. No validation. No immediate reward. Only architecture. And architecture is slow. But slow becomes permanent. The third lock is patience with precision. Not waiting blindly. Waiting with alignment. Every move calculated. Every risk measured. Every exposure limited. You do not avoid risk. You define it. You do not chase returns. You control downside. Because survival is the foundation of dominance. If you cannot be removed, you eventually become central. And centrality becomes authority. Authority becomes gravity. And gravity pulls everything toward it. This is how influence compounds. Not through noise, but through structural inevitability. The vault was never about money. It was about insulation. Insulation from volatility. From emotion. From external control. Once insulated, clarity increases. Once clear, decisions sharpen. Once sharp, outcomes improve. And improved outcomes reinforce positioning. A cycle. Most never see this cycle because they are addicted to motion. Motion feels productive. Stillness feels uncomfortable. But stillness allows evaluation. Evaluation allows adjustment. Adjustment prevents collapse. The third lock closes when you accept this. You do not need to win loudly. You need to remain unshaken. The market does not respect effort. It respects durability. Durability comes from structure. Structure comes from foresight. Foresight comes from restraint. Restraint is the rarest asset in modern ambition. If you master restraint, you master timing. If you master timing, you master leverage. And leverage, when compounded, becomes power. Not dramatic power, stable power, quiet power, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that does not fluctuate with opinion, the kind that survives cycles. The vault door does not slam, it seals. And once sealed, noise remains outside. Inside is clarity, and clarity is advantage. The combination was never hidden. It was ignored. 3 locks: perception, control, positioning. Most stop at the first. Some attempt the second. Few master the third. And those few rarely speak. Because when structure is correct, explanation becomes unnecessary. Silence becomes confirmation.